is a very quiet feeling. There is no one truly there to support you anymore. There is no reassurance, no clear signal that everything will be okay. And in that state, the question begins to emerge, not loudly, but inevitably. When no one is by your side, how will you continue? Most of us have never truly learned how to stand alone. We are used to being reflected, guided, validated. But Carl Jung saw this in a completely different way. He believed that the very periods when no one is there are where the deepest transformation begins, not externally, but within the structure of your inner self. What truly happens when you no longer have anyone to rely on, and why that very state, despite its difficulty, can become the starting point for a kind of growth that no external condition can replace. And if you are in that phase, then perhaps this is not the moment you are falling behind, but the moment you begin moving in a direction that very few people dare to enter. Number 1. The collapse of the illusion that someone will come to save you. There are periods in life when you are not exactly failing, but you also cannot say that you are moving forward. You are still there, still trying, still holding everything together. But deep inside, there is a feeling that is hard to name. As if you are waiting for something. Not a specific goal, not a clear plan, but a moment when everything will somehow become easier. Someone will appear, an opportunity will open, or something from the outside will shift the trajectory of your life. And in that silent waiting, you do not realize that you are postponing truly living. Difficulty becomes great enough. Something or someone will appear to help you through. Over time, that structure becomes an invisible part of how you perceive life, causing you to hold back a portion of your energy for waiting, instead of fully stepping into the present. But life does not always repeat itself the way you once experienced it. There are periods when you will receive no intervention at all. No one comes, no signal appears, no sign that things are about to change. And in that silence, you begin to feel a sense of emptiness. Not because the situation is too difficult, but because the expectation within you is no longer being met. What truly collapses is not your life, but the belief that an external force will arrive at the right moment. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When you do not recognize this structure of waiting, you live as if your life depends on factors beyond your control, and you call it not the right time, bad luck, or not meeting the right person yet. But when you begin to see it, you realize that the delay in your life does not come from circumstances, but from the way you quietly place your trust in something that was never guaranteed. Like a boat anchored in the middle of the sea, believing that a current will carry it to shore, when in reality, the ocean has no obligation to take you anywhere. Only when you lift the anchor and steer yourself does the boat begin to move. The moment you realize no one is coming to save you is not a loss. It is a severance from an illusion that has kept you in a state of waiting for too long. And in the space it leaves behind, you may feel empty, as if part of your inner foundation has disappeared. But it is precisely in that space that you truly begin to stand on your own, without relying on anything external. And perhaps that is the true beginning of rising. Not when you have enough conditions, but when you no longer place your future in something that was never guaranteed. Because when you stop waiting for rescue, you do not just lose an illusion, you reclaim your entire capacity to move. On the contrary, you enter a strange state where everything seems slower, emptier, and more difficult to understand. The familiar signals that guided your reactions begin to fade. External goals no longer hold central importance, and you begin to realize that much of your mind was previously filled with things that did not originate from within you. As those layers withdraw, a space opens, not merely emptiness, but a territory that has never been truly observed. Within that space, psychological content begins to emerge in subtle ways. It does not appear in clear forms, nor does it arrive as answers you can immediately grasp. Instead, it surfaces as fragmented memories, recurring images, familiar emotions without clear origins. There are things you thought you had forgotten that return without reason. There are patterns in how you perceive the world that you had never noticed before. And most importantly, none of this is new. It has always been there. You simply never had enough stillness to see it. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What he emphasized is the necessity of having the courage to face what has always existed beneath the surface of consciousness, realizing they have always been present, silently shaping your experience of life. The state of isolation functions in the same way. It is not a punishment, but a gateway. When there is no one beside you to reflect you, when the familiar environment no longer defines you, your attention naturally turns inward. You begin to observe what is happening within you. And what makes this experience uncomfortable is its unfamiliarity, the removal of the layers that once covered what has always been underneath. Like entering a dark room that was once always lit, you begin to realize that everything in that darkness was always there. You simply never needed to look closely before. When the light goes out, the room does not become more chaotic. Rather, it is the first time you truly see what has always existed. That is why the feeling of isolation is a sign that you are approaching a deeper layer of yourself. Not to solve everything immediately, not to understand it all, but to recognize that there is a part of you always operating beneath every surface experience. And only when you are quiet enough to remain in that space can you begin to see what was previously hidden. And that is the next step in rising when no one is by your side. That isolation is no longer emptiness, but a depth you had never touched before. If you are in this stage, you may not find it easy to put into words. Not for others to understand you, but to acknowledge that you have begun to touch a deeper layer within yourself. Number 3. Acting without external recognition. And once you begin to see what lies beneath the surface of consciousness, another question quietly emerges, yet cannot be avoided. If no one is watching you, will you still continue moving forward? There is a truth many people do not realize until they are truly alone. Much of what you used to do was tied to being seen. It doesn't have to be a crowd, sometimes just a few eyes, a small acknowledgement, a response that reassures you that you are on the right path. But when all of that disappears, another kind of emptiness emerges, not related to thoughts or memories, but directly to your movement in life. You begin to notice that things that once motivated you now feel faint, not because they have lost value, but because the link between action and feedback has been cut. And in that moment, you face a very direct question. If no one sees, no one acknowledges, no one responds, will you still do it? She said, I realized I had gotten used to writing to be seen, but I had never truly written just to write. And then, after a long period of silence, she returned. But this time, she did not post anywhere. She wrote in the morning, wrote in the evening, without sharing, without waiting for feedback. A few months later, she said something very simple. For the first time, I know what it feels like to write without needing anyone to read. From a scientific perspective, this can be explained through the dopamine mechanism in the brain. When you perform an action and receive positive feedback, the brain associates that action with reward, creating motivation to repeat it. But when the reward disappears, the system weakens, causing the action to lose its initial appeal. However, when a person continues acting without external reward, the brain begins to establish a different form of reinforcement, where motivation comes from the process itself, no longer dependent on outcome or feedback. Carl Jung once said, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." What he pointed to is not doing something to achieve something, but acting from an inner need, a force that does not require explanation or proof. When you reach that point, action is no longer a means to gain recognition, but becomes a natural expression of who you are. At a deeper level, you begin to realize that continuing to act in silence does not just change outcomes, it changes the way you exist. Every time you do something without being witnessed, you cut another thread binding you to the outside world. Gradually, you no longer live in reaction to others' perception, but begin to live from a more stable inner axis. And it is this stability that becomes the true foundation for any lasting progress. This is the transition very few people pass through. Not doing more, not trying harder, but changing the source of action. When you no longer need feedback to continue, a different kind of freedom begins to emerge, where you can keep moving forward, even when no one is by your side. And from that point, your journey slowly detaches from the need to be seen, becoming a sustained movement that depends only on whether you continue walking. Number 4. Breaking the belief that your value depends on others. If you are able to continue acting without any external recognition, then something else begins to surface, deeper and more difficult to grasp. You realize that your sense of value has never truly stood independently, but has always been shaped through how others reflect you. For most of your life, you have not directly experienced your value as something inherent. Instead, you see yourself through the eyes, reactions, and attitudes of your environment. When others appreciate you, you feel valuable. When that feedback disappears or changes, your sense of self fluctuates accordingly. This happens so subtly that you rarely question it, because it has become the default way you understand who you are. But when that reflection is no longer there, what collapses is not just the feeling of being recognized, but the very reference point you used to define yourself. You no longer know where you stand, no longer have a familiar framework to measure your value. And in that state, a very particular emptiness emerges, one where you can no longer rely on what once confirmed you. Carl Jung called this structure the persona, a psychological mask that helps you adapt to the outside world. It is necessary, because without it, you could not function in society. But the problem is not that the persona exists. The problem is that you unconsciously identify with it. You believe you are the image others see, when in fact, that is only a part shaped to fit circumstances. Loss of being seen in the way he once was. No one needed him anymore, no sense of being important in someone else's life. He said, I am still me, but I no longer know who I am when no one needs me. That ambiguity left him deeply disoriented. For a while, Adam tried to regain that familiar feeling, or to find another relationship to fill the void. But nothing felt the same. Only when he stopped and observed that emptiness did he realize that most of the value he believed in had never come from within. It had always been maintained through being useful in the eyes of others. Like a mirror being taken away, you no longer see your reflection, not because you disappeared, but because you had become used to only seeing yourself through reflection. And when the mirror is gone, you stand before a very different reality. You still exist, but there is no image to rely on. Carl Jung once wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society." What he pointed to is that the relationship between the individual and the world always passes through an intermediary layer. And when that layer stops functioning, you enter an undefined state where you cannot use old standards to understand yourself. This state is often mistaken for being lost, but in truth, it is a transition. You are no longer the old version confirmed by your environment, but you have not yet formed a new inner anchor, and that is why it feels empty, as if everything that once held you steady is gone. But if you are patient enough to remain in that state, without rushing to find a new image to cling to, you begin to realize something essential. Value does not need to be confirmed in order to exist. It does not depend on being seen, nor on being reflected back. And when you no longer need a mirror to know who you are, another movement begins to take place, quiet yet profound. The energy that once flowed outward no longer finds anything to attach to, and it gradually withdraws inward. For a long time, most of your psychological energy has been tied to specific objects, people, goals, expectations, or visions that you believe would bring meaning to your life. You invested in them, followed them, and maintained a continuous connection with the outside world. But when those anchor points no longer hold a central role, this stream of energy does not disappear. It begins to lose direction, creating a space that is very difficult to describe. This state is often misunderstood as a loss of motivation, but in reality, it is a sign that the way your inner energy operates is changing. You no longer feel drawn toward what once attracted you, and you no longer feel the urge to constantly move outward as before. This quietness makes you think you are losing something, while in fact, another process is silently unfolding deep within. Like a river blocked at its outlet, the water does not disappear. It rises behind the dam, forming a growing reservoir. From the outside, everything may appear still, but internally pressure is building. And this pressure, if not dispersed again, will gradually find a new path, not along the old trajectory, but along a route that has never existed before. Carl Jung once wrote, "Psychic energy is not a static quantity, but a dynamic process." What he emphasized is that psychological energy is always in motion, always transforming its form of expression. In the past, whenever something became overwhelming, you could turn to someone, to share, to be heard, or simply to feel lighter. But when no one is there anymore, that familiar option, is no longer available. And it is precisely at this moment that you are forced to remain with your emotions, not as something that must be immediately resolved, but as an experience unfolding within you. In the Bible, there is a very particular image of Jesus' journey in the desert. For 40 days, he was alone, without support, without anyone to share with or ease the inner trials. What appeared during that time was not external circumstance, but inner temptations and impulses, voices that required him to face them directly, without escape. And what is remarkable is not that he defeated them, but the way he remained with them, recognized them, without being carried away. When there is no one to hold your emotions for you, you begin to realize that emotions are not something that forces you to react immediately. In the past, every emotion seemed to come with an action. Sadness required expression. Discomfort required release. Anxiety required something to soothe it. But when that familiar pathway is no longer available, a pause begins to appear, where the emotion is still there, but it no longer pulls you into immediate reaction as before. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist not only persists, it will grow in size." What he pointed to is not the need to eliminate emotions, but the fact that the more you try to avoid or push them away, the more they continue to exist in different forms. But when you stop trying to change or escape them, and simply remain with them, something else begins to happen. You are no longer dependent on others to regulate your internal state. Gradually, a very subtle shift begins to form. You no longer see emotions as problems that need to be solved, but as parts of your experience that need to be recognized. And when that happens, you are no longer controlled by what you feel, but begin to have just enough distance to see them without being carried away. It is not about becoming stronger in the sense of resisting emotions, but about no longer needing to run away from them. When you can stay with what is happening inside you, without needing another person to soothe or validate it, you begin to stand in a very different way, independent of circumstances, independent of anyone's presence. Sometimes, speaking is not about being solved, but about realizing that you are not the only one walking through this journey. Number 7. The formation of an identity independent of the environment. And when you are able to remain with what is happening within you, without relying on any external anchor, a quiet integration begins to form. Everything that once defined you gradually falls away, revealing a state of existence no longer dependent on the environment. He entered a very different kind of silence. No one called him by familiar titles anymore, no constant validation of his role, and he said, "I no longer know who I am when I am not standing in front of others." But within that period, something else began to unfold. It was not that he found a new definition, but that he gradually no longer needed any definition at all. He still read, still reflected, still existed in his own way, but no longer questioned whether those things defined him. And after some time, he realized something very strange. When he stopped trying to become someone, he began to feel clearer than ever, not as an image, but as a presence. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." What he meant is not becoming an ideal version of yourself, but the process of removing layer after layer that once covered your true nature. And this process does not happen by adding, but by allowing what is no longer aligned to fall away. Not from knowing who you are, from no longer needing to ask that question. This is not a final or perfect state. It is a new foundation, where you are no longer bound by the need to fit into any image in order to exist. And because of that, you can move, change, adapt, without feeling that you are losing yourself, because yourself is no longer confined to any fixed form. And perhaps, this is the deepest point in the journey of rising when no one is by your side. It is not about becoming independent in the sense of separating from the world, but about no longer needing the world to confirm your existence. When you can stand without a role, without reflection, without definition, you are not just moving forward, you are existing in a way you have never experienced before. A way of being that is independent, yet stable enough to move through any circumstance without losing yourself. Not because they are hiding, but because they no longer need to be seen in order to continue. They do not build themselves based on attention, nor define their value through the world's response. Instead, they move from a foundation that no one can give them, and no one can take away. Necessary, but in reality only made you dependent. A person can go very far without anyone noticing, not because they are hiding, but because they no longer need to be seen in order to continue. They do not build themselves based on attention, nor define their value through the world's response. Instead, they move from a foundation that no one can give them, and no one can take away.
Wow.